Hi, I'm Jason Alster, and welcome to another episode of Meet the Author. Today we have with us Christopher Weber. Thank you for coming.
Pleasure to be here.
Christopher Weber is the author of more than 24 books, including Reinventing Marriage and Beyond Beowulf. A graduate of Princeton University and a priest of the Episcopal Church, Weber has served parishes in New York and Connecticut, as well as Tokyo, Japan, and has also written several hymns. His interest in James W.C. Pennington developed while compiling a yearbook of American saints. Weber lives with his wife on an old farm in northwestern Connecticut in a house lighted by solar panels and heated with wood he cuts and splits. Christopher wrote the book American to the Backbone. It's the story of James W.C. Pennington, the fugitive slave who became one of the first black abolitionists. Where did the idea to come this book, and why did you want to write it?
Well, as you say, I was working on another book called A Year with American Saints, and I came across the name of James Pennington. I hadn't heard of him before, and I was impressed with his story. But most particularly, he wrote the story of his escape from slavery. He published it to raise money for the abolition movement. And what impressed me about it was that here's this man who at the age of 19 was a slave and illiterate. He escaped from slavery, and starting from zero at age 19, he became 7 years later the first black student at Yale. And I thought to myself, well, I could go on. 20 years later, he was given an honorary doctorate by the University of Heidelberg.
What years are we talking about exactly?
Good question, yes. He was at Yale in the 1830s, 1834, 1837. In that period of time, it was about 1849. He was given an honorary doctorate.
So he was in Yale as a free slave, as a free person, during the time that there was still slavery in the South?
Still slavery in Connecticut, as a matter of fact.
Even in Connecticut?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
It had been outlawed, but those who were slaves were still continued in slavery. Mm-hmm. So there was still slavery in Connecticut well into the 19th century. And Connecticut, of course, a big manufacturing area, depended a lot on the cotton from the South, and there was a good deal of interest in Connecticut in maintaining the slavery system, too. And when Pennington got to Yale, he was still technically a fugitive slave. He could have been captured and taken back south at any time. But what impressed me was that here was this young man, beginning at the age of 19 as an illiterate, who accomplished such incredible things. To be ordained, to get an honorary doctorate from a German university, to travel in Europe, to become pastor of a big New York congregation, and to write the first black history. And I thought, this is a story that ought to be told for the benefit of young people, particularly young black people, who might look around and say, what chance do I have? Mm-hmm. Well, what chance did he have? But he accomplished an enormous amount because he was determined to do it. And because this is a country in which there is a great deal of freedom to accomplish amazing things.
That brings up, you wanted to write this story and bring the story to the public, but how come, already 100 years after the Civil War, how come Pennington wasn't better known?
That's a question I'm asked all the time. People say, well, I've heard about Frederick Douglass. Why haven't I heard about James Pennington? And I said, well, Frederick Douglass was a full-time abolitionist. All he did was work for abolition. He wrote, he spoke, he traveled, he was an abolitionist. Pennington had a day job. He was pastor of a congregation. He had to deal with the people that were sick or the babies to be baptized and all the administrative problems of a congregation. Mm-hmm. And his abolition work was something in addition to that. Mm-hmm. So although he was an eloquent spokesman and leader and accomplished enormous things, still he takes second place in terms of familiarity to Frederick Douglass. He actually performed Frederick Douglass's marriage. So, and the two of them worked very closely together. They knew each other well.
And you said something about his oratory. While you're looking for that, I'll just read another part about the book for our audience. When I went to school, black history was not taught. I have learned a good deal about both black and white history while researching this book and the debt we owe to those who, like James C. Pennington, called our country to fulfill the vision of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That a man who was illiterate at the age of 19 could be teaching school 5 years later is evidence of the potential so often wasted. I hope this book will provide new evidence of the need to keep opportunities open for others to fulfill their potential. How much was that important in the purpose of you wanting to write this book?
Well, I think it's very important. It's been important to me, I think, all my life that our country become more nearly what it sets out to be. You know, it's interesting. I went to a Memorial Day celebration in Cornwall, Connecticut on Monday, and the speaker was Sam Waterston, who lives in Cornwall when he's not on location somewhere. He'd been asked to read the Gettysburg Address, and they said, give us a little context. So he said, what we need to remember is Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address said, we're fighting to preserve the principle of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. And Waterston said, the Declaration of Independence is our founding document, not the Constitution. That can be interpreted to give corporations equal rights and so on. But he said, the Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal. And I think Pennington and so many others have been inspired by that simple statement. All men are created equal, just 5 words.
Well, that's the basis of America.
But they take it seriously. They say, yes, it's possible. One of the most amazing things I came across was a newspaper editorial written in a little New York newspaper published by the African American population of New York City called The Colored American. It was about 1838. They published an editorial on the importance of getting an education. They said, we must get our children an education because if they have an education, they will be qualified to be president of the United States. I came across that, I couldn't believe it. I said 180 years ago, they saw what was possible. 10 years ago, how many Americans thought that we could have a black president? But in 1838, they said, if we get an education, it's possible, because they believed the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. And Pennington set out with that in mind. And do you want me to give an example of...
Sure, give an example of his oratory. He wrote this? He wrote this?
He wrote this, he spoke this, yes.
And this was a person who was illiterate? Okay.
Illiterate at the age of 19.
Okay, what age was he when he wrote this?
Oh, it was probably 20 years later.
20 years later.
Right.
So
he talks at one place about how he set out to rid his language of slavery's idioms and to become a kind of polished orator that would enable him to make his case in any audience. And here's what he was capable of doing. And here is an eternal truth that is destined to beat away every refuge of lies that can be brought by the ingenuity of critics to support slavery. When you have made of man a slave by a sevenfold process of selling, bartering, and chaining, and garnishing him with that rough and bloody brush, the cart whip, and set him to the full by blowing into the eyes of his mind cloud after cloud of moral darkness, his own immortality still remains. Subtract from it what you can, immortality still remains. And this is a weapon in the bosom of the slave, which is more terrible and terrifying to the slaveholder than the thunder of triumphal artillery in the ears of a retreating army. One little bit more. They tell us.
I wonder what context did he give this oratory as at the pulpit in his church or?
Actually,
do you know?
This was spoken at a public meeting, not in church. There were summer gatherings very often. This was a grove outside Hartford, where they would gather on a Saturday or a Sunday.
And Pennington was a resident of Hartford, you said.
At that point, yes, right. But he says, just another couple sentences. They tell us that slavery is here and that it must remain, and it is useless to discuss it. They say that however desirable it may be that slavery should be abolished, it cannot be done. It is impossible. We lay down as a general truth that what is desirable is possible with God and is possible unto us with God's aid. Let our means harmonize with the moral government of God. Let our plans harmonize with God's wisdom. Let our plans harmonize with the perceptible economy of providence, and what becomes of the impossibility? It is annihilated. So that makes me think of Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah, that's pretty
it's that kind of oratory. And it's that kind of confidence that is so impressive to me, that all we need to do is be aware of God's purpose. All men are created equal. God is working out that purpose in history. We work with God. We don't need to be angry. We don't need to be violent. Just do the best we can where God has put us, and we'll get there. And it's, Martin Luther King talked about the arc of history. The arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. I think it's the same thing that Pennington was saying. God is at work in history.
Did Martin Luther King know of Pennington?
I've been asked that question, and I wish I could answer it. You know, everything that Martin Luther King Jr. stood for is in Pennington's writing. He made a speech in Hartford in 1842 about disobedience. A law must be moral, or there is no need to obey it. He said some of the Constitution, the Constitution provides for fugitive slaves, the return of fugitive slaves. He said that is a covenant with hell. It is an immoral covenant, and we have no reason to obey it. That's exactly what Martin Luther King Jr. was saying 100 and some years later. So it's there, but I can't...
Well, the Constitution was written by man in the end. What kind of research did you do, and where did you do it to gather the information for the book?
Right, I spent about 4 years doing research, and there are amazing resources here in Connecticut. I spent probably an average of 1 day a week in one of the great university libraries. And there are many libraries at Yale. I know 4 or 5 of them intimately. And Wesleyan is the other place. And then the Connecticut State Library and the Connecticut Historical Society. Those are all major resources. And I set out to do this not being sure that I could find what I needed to do to write a really full-scale biography of this man. One man I talked to said, somebody like that left footprints. Well,
yeah, definitely.
The footprints are there. They're definitely there. One major resource that I discovered at Yale...
Well, how did you get that oratory? Where was that written? For instance, you just read an oratory.
Yeah.
Where did you get that from?
Well, a lot of that is in newspapers that were published at the time, particularly the Colored American. A lot of his speeches in that. Some of his speeches were published. The speech that he gave, in which he calls the Constitution a covenant with hell, that was published in Hartford.
So he was known, but not well-known? Or
he was well-known at that time. There was a Negro convention movement that began about 1830. The first gathering of free black people in America was held in Philadelphia in 1830. And they set out to draw together free black people to state their case, because some very well-intentioned white liberals had decided we can solve America's race problem by sending black people to Africa, and then we won't have a race problem. Right, that's how Liberia came to be. They began the American Colonization Society, and they had the best motives in the world, and the presidents of Princeton, Harvard, Yale, Columbia, former presidents, Supreme Court justices, Daniel Webster, Francis Scott Key, they were all members of the American Colonization Society. And black people heard about that and they said, what? They want to send us to Africa? I've never been to Africa. Why would I want to go to Africa?
Well, that was an important point that I read.
Right.
They already had felt themselves as Americans.
Absolutely.
And they saw a difference between themselves and someone who might have come from Africa. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, James Pennington at a point said, I am an American to the backbone. I came across that, and that's
so
my title.
we have the title, so tell us a little bit about that title. That's an interesting title.
Well, of course, the point he's making is the same point they were making at the black conventions, that we are Americans. They said, our ancestors, the sweat of our ancestors is in the soil. We had grandparents who died in the Revolution fighting for freedom. This is our country.
So they understood connection to the land very well.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
At that time.
Yes.
And the term American to the backbone, is that a specific term that Pennington used, or that was a well-known term at the time, or
I don't think
heard of it?
No, I don't think so. I think that was a term that he used as a way of emphasizing, I am an American. and I deserve the respect that every American citizen ought to be able to get. I am an American to the backbone. I think, we'll say I am something or other to the backbone.
Well, they'll say American is apple pie.
American is apple pie, right. Yes. I don't know if that would have been quite as effective, but it's the same point, yes. And the impressive thing is that given the contrast between the American colonization society and the Negro Convention movement, that on the one hand you had all these leaders and shakers and powerful people, and on the other hand you had fugitive slaves, nobodies. And there are two visions of what America could be. An all-white society with no race problem, or an integrated society with no race problem. And it's the nobodies that won. Insofar as we have lived out either vision, it's their vision that has become our goal, and we're far closer to it. We're not there yet, but we are so much further nearer to it than anybody might have imagined a generation ago.
And you mentioned that reading this book could change how we think and act today. That was one of your purposes for the book. In what way do you think that a reader today, if he read the book, it somehow would change how he thinks or acts?
Well, specifically, of course, as I said, young people reading it say, well, it is perhaps possible. I might be able to make something of my life. For all of us, I think it tells us something about our country that we may not be aware of. As you said, I didn't study black history in school. It wasn't taught when I was in school. We didn't know a lot about our own history. There's just sort of, there were slaves, and then there was a civil war, and that solved that problem, and now we lived happily ever after. Well, not that simple. And what led up to the Civil War is the major part of this book, and a subject that I really didn't know anything about until I got into this. And I'd majored in American history in school, in college. I've always been fascinated by American history. I've read widely in American history. I'd never heard of James Pennington. I didn't know much about I'd never heard of the Negro Convention movement. We need to know our history in order to recognize how far we've come and be grateful for that, and sort of rededicate ourselves, as Lincoln said at Gettysburg.
Well, you know that famous term, the victors write the history.
Well, and up until now, the history's been written by the people in power, and they weren't necessarily friends of James Pennington.
What have you done to promote this book, and how are you promoting it? And how strongly do you feel, how author promotes the book, it's how strongly he feels about the message, and how important he feels the book is to the readers.
Right.
What are you doing?
Well, I feel very strongly about it. I mean, there was a full-scale review of it in the Wall Street American. There have been articles like that.
Wall Street American?
The Wall Street Journal.
Oh, Wall Street Journal.
The Wall Street Journal. And I was invited to speak about it at the Smithsonian and so on. But I think...
Did you take that invitation? Are you going to take it?
Absolutely.
So you were at the Smithsonian. You talked about this book at the Smithsonian.
Yes. I think this is the 47th or 48th event at which I've spoken about this book. Some of it on television. I spoke at the old State House in Hartford. That was televised. But I've spoken in libraries where only 3 or 4 people showed up. And that's fine. I will go anywhere and talk to any crowd to get this message out, because I think it's an important one. And I put 4 years of my life into it, so I must think it was important. I think it is important for all of us to understand our country, to realize the struggle it has been to get where we are, and to appreciate and value those who enabled us to get this far along the road. And James Pennington is just such a remarkable example of A, what is possible in this country, and B, the kind of change that can take place when people dedicate themselves to making this country a better place.
Well, in this day and age, where we already had a civil rights movement, and there are many books out there now,
Right.
So you have competition.
Right.
Who comes to your talks, and what type of people come to your talk, and what type of questions do you hear, or what message are they looking for?
one of the gratifying things is that I think all kinds of people come to these talks. There are people that are just interested in American history and that sort of thing. But I took a chance. I called the library in the little town in upstate New York where I grew up, a town of 3,000 people. Nobody's ever
Cuba,
heard of
New York?
Cuba, New York. You've heard of it because I told you. Cuba, New York. I called the librarian and I said, this is a silly question. You've never heard of me, but I grew up in Cuba. And I've written a book. And I don't know whether you do author events, but I would love to come and talk about it where I grew up. And she could not have been more cordial. Invited me to come.
Did you say Cuban to the backbone?
Cuban to the backbone, right. She arranged that they would put me up overnight. There was an honorarium. They did everything they could to publicize it. And most dramatically of all, she got a phone call from a social studies teacher in a town 8 miles away, Friendship, New York, asking
Friendship, New York.
Isn't that a great
You don't
name?
have these names anymore.
No, they don't. But Cuba and Friendship, they're great names. Anyway, the social study teacher called to ask if she could bring her 11th grade social studies class to hear me talk. And that was one of the most wonderful things that's happened over the last year in which I've been talking about this book, here, there, and the other place. A group of 16, 17-year-old kids.
I have an idea for you, since I know there are authors who are very successful at going and giving book talks at schools. Maybe you need to make a children's version of the book.
Well, actually, I set out to do a children's version of the book.
Really?
That was what I wanted to do first. Pennington wrote the story of his escape. He called it The Fugitive Blacksmith because he'd been trained as a blacksmith. So he called it The Fugitive Blacksmith. And it's a little book which he published in England to raise money for the abolition movement. I found that when I first was beginning this whole thing. And I said, I went to an author's agent. I'd never even had an agent. I found an author's agent and I said, I think this book ought to be republished. It ought to be modernized. It's a little Victorian, but modernize it and get it out there for teenagers to read.
Really? That's a good idea.
And he came back and said, no, you need to do a full-scale biography. So I've done it. And I said, well, what about my idea? He said, well, that's a spin-off. We'll deal with it later. So, yes, we need the spin-off. I've got on my computer
That'd be a fantastic book.
2 different versions of a sort of a
So is that
high
your
school.
next book?
No.
I have to wait.
I got 2 or 3 others.
Spin-off.
2 or 3 others in the pipeline. But I still want that to happen. I want to get that out there. I've done 2 versions. I've done an update of Pennington's own story, the way he told it, and then I've done a much shortened version, a sort of Reader's Digest version of this book, just telling it my own way. And I don't care. I just like one of them to be out there because I think it's something that people ought to see and be able to read.
Well, you did write many other books, about 20.
Yes.
How many?
Well, somewhere around 24, 25.
24, which mentioned some other books that you also wrote. Are there any historical books? Are any of those historical books like this one? Or biographies?
Nothing, no, I haven't written any other biographies. I've written books, as you said, I'm an Episcopal priest. I've written about the Episcopal Church. I've written a guidebook for vestries, for goodness sake. Not something you sit down and read cover to cover, but it sells several thousand copies every year, year after year after year.
Wow.
I've written a sequel to Beowulf.
Yeah, I just saw I saw like 3 movie versions of Beowulf. We're talking
And they're dreadful.
the written story. Actually, one of them was
Right.
quite good. Beowulf and Grendel was a good one.
Yes.
But
That one I haven't seen.
why did you have an interest in Beowulf?
I like language. I think that's one of the main things.
This is very interesting. Now that you mention that, I know when I was a child in school, we had to read Beowulf, and looking back now, I said, what were they thinking of? Why that? Well, did it have something to do with the language?
Well, they say it's the oldest story in the English language.
Okay.
And it's so old, it's not even English anymore.
Correct.
If I start quoting it to you, or the fire's fang, or the flood's wheel, or the gripe of meaches, or the garrus flight, that's not English as we understand it. But it's beautiful language. And I first thought I might do my own translation. It's been done. Other people have done it, didn't need that. So then I did a sequel to it in alliterated poetry, so it would sound like the original Beowulf. That's been out there for probably 6-7 years now, called Beyond Beowulf.
And what's the story about?
It's what happened when Beowulf ends. Because Beowulf ends, if you remember, Beowulf kills the dragon, and the dragon
Right.
kills Beowulf. So it's like Hamlet. At the end of the story, everybody's lying dead on the stage. But they cremate Beowulf. And as the funeral pyre is going up, there's a woman calling out, "What will become of us now? Our enemies will discover that Beowulf is not here to defend us, so what will happen to us?" And that's where it ends. Well, what happened? What
okay.
did happen? Well, in my sequel, their enemies discover that Beowulf isn't there to defend them. The enemies attack. They decide they can't stay there. They get in their ships. They take off around Sweden and Norway and wind up in England. And
They're going to have to
So-
get the book. So
yes,
we're going to finish with that, and I want to thank you for coming. And anybody who wants to read your books can look up under Chris Weber. And that was excellent. American to the backbone. Thank you.
thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.